Hello and welcome to our Direct Talk. Today we're having a follow-up interview with Martin Plaut regarding the implementation of the peace agreement. Mr. Plaut, thank you so much for joining us today.
Pleasure.
November 4th marks 1 year since the signing of the peace agreement. Can you provide an update on the progress made in implementing the agreement? What percent of it has been completed?
Well, I think it's extremely difficult to know. I mean, the problem is, in a sense, based on two things. First of all, the agreement itself was not very clear. It was drawn up in two different places, in both Pretoria and in Nairobi. And yes, it did the business. It brought a measure of peace, and it laid out a plan for having a disarmament process and set up how this would be monitored. But what it did not do is allow for this to be done in an open and transparent manner. So there just have not been the kind of report backs to, shall we say, the public via the media or anybody else that we'd really need to be able to make a decent assessment of this. Have most of the heavy weapons been handed over by the Tigrayans? Yes, that looks as if that has happened. Have the Ethiopian forces taken control of the borders of Ethiopia, which was supposed to happen? We are hearing that that is happening, but we're also hearing that Eritrean forces are mounting a reinforcement process along the borders, which is very worrying. And the real question is where this is going, and we just don't know at this stage. I mean, one of the other things that I think is pretty clear is that the process of returning Tigrayan soldiers to civilian life has also not happened. I mean, there are, I am told, many people who are in the military who have not been allowed to return home because people, I think, are worried. And I mean, you would know that much better than I do in Mekelle, that they are worried that there is the threat of either from the Amhara or from the Eritreans or from somewhere else, which would threaten your security and integrity. And this was underlined today when we saw the arrival in Addis of three Globemaster planes coming from the United Arab Emirates. Now they arrived at the Bisho Air Force Base. You don't bring balloons; you bring weapons with them. Now, of course, what exactly they're carrying, we don't know. But these all underline the situation that the threat to the region is real. The remarks that Prime Minister Abiy made about the sea and the need for a navy and all those things have only ratcheted up the tension. And this comes at a time when there are reports of real economic difficulties facing Ethiopia, with the Fitch credit rating agency downgrading the rating of Ethiopia below junk bond status. I mean, essentially saying to international investors, you can lend here, but wow, are you going to be under a threat? And Ethiopia is close to bankruptcy and is facing all these threats. Now, where is it going to go? We can't be sure. But, this is the situation that the people of Tigray find themselves in now, insecure, both at a national and international level.
Which parties are fulfilling their parts and which parties aren't?
Well, yes. I mean, it looks as if the Tigrayans have done most of what was required of them. And as I said, the Ethiopians appear to be taking some responsibility for the international border, particularly with Ethiopia. But one of the big questions that was not answered in Pretoria was: are we going back to the original constitution that was drawn up after 1991? If we are, then it would require that the borders of Tigray, frankly, go all the way to Sudan, which is something that the Tigrayan armed forces were never able to achieve during 2 years of bitter fighting. And that the Amhara, the Fano, the Eritreans, who have occupied such large areas uh, of Tigray would have to withdraw. Now, all the indications are that they have not, that there are still Eritrean forces, particularly in the north, but also in the northwest. Now, of course, there are some areas of Tigray that Eritrea is legitimately in because of the Boundary Commission, the International Boundary Commission that was drawn up after the 98-2000 war. And, there are areas of Tigray that the Tigrayans, like Irob, which Tigrayans bitterly resent giving up, but I'm afraid are part of Eritrea by international treaty. And that was a treaty drawn up between Prime Minister Meles and not a treaty, but an agreement drawn up by Prime Minister Meles and President Isaias. And that's the international boundary. It's a bitter, bitter fate for the people of Irob, and they are in very real difficulties. I understand that, but it's going to be hard. So there are in a sense pluses and minuses on both sides.
Okay, so my next question would be about the transitional justice and accountability.
The agreement places significant expectations on the federal government regarding the transitional justice. Do you believe enough has been done in this regard? And what is your expectation from the agreeing parties?
Well, there's an old joke that is told here in Britain, which goes something like this: you meet somebody in a, shall we say, a part of the country you don't know, and you say, "How do you get to this town?" And the person turns to you and says, "Well, I wouldn't start from here." Now it's a joke because, of course, that's exactly what you're having to do. But in reality, I think that, and this is something that is really, really appalling, and that is that I do not think that justice is going to come from this peace agreement. I think the whole process has ground to a halt. The fact that the Ethiopian authorities, Prime Minister Abiy and others would not cooperate with the system that was put in place by the United Nations to investigate it means that it's left to the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, which is a very weak and frankly government-dominated body. And, I'm afraid, I think that justice is not going to be served. You will not receive the justice that the people, and particularly the women of Tigray, deserve. I think that it's an absolute travesty of a situation, but I don't want to hold out hope where I think there is none.
And the ICHRE's report highlights shortcomings in the consultative process for transitional justice and the pillars of victims' right to truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-repetition. What are your concerns about the difficulty of implementing transitional justice, especially in high-risk environments?
Well, you don't get what you don't win on the battlefield. The reason that after the Second World War, the European powers, particularly Britain, France, and the United States, were able to hold the Nazis to account for what they did in the Second World War and in the Holocaust, was because the Germany lost. Now, I'm afraid you will not get justice, I think, except under very exceptional circumstances, unless you can win. Now, why was it that some of the Serb leaders were held to account by the international community after the Yugoslav wars? Was because the Serbs essentially lost, and then justice can be enforced. I mean, who has been held to account in Rwanda for the genocide? Yes, it has been a lot of the Hutu leaders, many of whom were forced out of power and fled into the Congo. But the atrocities committed by the Tutsis, and there were atrocities committed by the Tutsis, have never been addressed. So I'm afraid when they say there is victor's justice, that is true. And I think looking to the United Nations and international bodies and expecting them to deliver on promises that they made and that they make in the future, I think are unlikely to be fulfilled. And it is a bitter, bitter fate for Tigrayans. But I think, to be honest with you, I think you're going to have to pick up the pieces yourselves. You have nobody to rely on but yourselves. Do not look to the international community, and you're going to have to find ways of living with the awful situation, particularly that women find themselves in.
Again, the ICHRE's report mentions that the policy option paper does not adequately reflect international and regional standards, particularly regarding accountability options. It reveals findings of crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, rape, and enforced disappearance. Why haven't any individuals been held accountable for the crimes? Could you comment on the challenges surrounding the accountability for such grave offenses?
Well, who's going to hold them accountable?
The international community, crime investigating parties.
Yeah, but they weren't allowed to go to Tigray, as you know. They weren't allowed to interview people. And even if they had been able to point the finger and say, this is the person who was responsible, and there certainly should have been army commanders, not just the soldiers who actually did it, who took responsibility for this, but they weren't able to do it. And without the cooperation of the Ethiopian government, quite frankly, the international community has given up on this one. It's finished.
The ICHRE's report also questions the government's cooperation with the human rights bodies, noting that the final report only addressed limited number of incidents in Tigray. Moreover, the Eritrean government has reportedly hindered the investigations by prohibiting access to areas it occupied. What actions have been taken to address these challenges, and what more can be done to ensure cooperation and accountability?
Well, I'm afraid the international community's attention, such as it is, which is limited, has now moved on, and there is a lack of pressure on the Ethiopian government, which was there for a while, and really the key question was economic. I think if the IMF and the World Bank were prepared to, at the suggestion of the United States, but other international partners, were prepared to say to Ethiopia, look, no money until you cooperate fully with the justice question, then something might have happened. But I don't see that happening. I don't think that although there's still some steps to go, I think Ethiopia will get the money it gets, because the international community requires Ethiopia to be part of its system of security in the Horn of Africa. And at the moment, the international community, certainly the West, is much more worried about the situation in Gaza and Israel, Palestine, which is appalling, and the involvement of Yemen, Iran, Lebanon. All those things are very, very concerning. And, that is what is on the top of the agenda. And I'm afraid, Tigray just isn't. I mean, if I look in the papers, I don't see the word Tigray.
Let me ask, why is that not happening? I mean, I can see the West is siding with Israel, and also it has sided with Ukraine. Why are there no actions that the international community is taking to save the people who were atrocities committed on? Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why? Because I think it's quite simple. There was a moment, and I think, let's be honest, President Biden sent very close friends of his when the war first erupted back in 2020. With the attacks by Eritrea, with the attacks by the Ethiopian government forces, the National Defense Forces, against Tigray. He did send, very senior colleagues. He sent his senators who were close personal friends of his. But he's got a zillion things on his plate, as well as re-election. He's got the concerns about artificial intelligence. He's got concerns about the Chinese. He's got concerns about Ukraine, about Russia. An American president, has about, maybe an hour a week to even vaguely think about international questions. And of those, maybe 10 minutes a week go on Africa. So, I mean, if that. So, I'm making up the statistics, but I'm just trying to suggest to you that it is Africa, the whole of Africa is not high up the agenda, and other questions force their way onto the agenda, and you have to then deal with them. It ain't happening anymore. So this is gone. It's finished as a subject.
Going back to the question of territorial integrity and external forces.
Territorial integrity of Tigray, as outlined in the constitution, is currently under external forces. The entire western Tigray, some parts of northwestern Tigray, and some parts of eastern, as well as 60% of Irob district, in particular, are under the invasion of Eritrean forces. And some vicinities in central Tigray and southern Tigray are also under the invasion of Eritrean forces. Why hasn't the Ethiopian government explicitly demanded the withdrawal of Eritrean troops to ensure the returns of territories as stipulated in the agreement?
Well, because I think, well, two reasons. First of all, as I mentioned to you, under the Boundary Commission, some areas of Tigray were lost. So there's some areas that Eritrea is legitimately in. Whether Tigrayans like that or not, that is the case. But that's a small percentage of what we're talking about. For the majority, the only way of the Ethiopian government or of its army to get the Eritreans out would be essentially to hold a gun to their heads and say, "Get out." Now, this has been underlined. It was underlined this week by Secretary of State Blinken, the American Secretary of State. He said, and this was repeated by 10 Western nations in a statement they brought out, I think it was yesterday, saying that Eritrea must leave. Yes, you're right. They call for it. But who is going to force President Isaias to withdraw his forces? It would require a war. I don't think he will do it willingly. He sees this as a lever that he has. He failed in his major objective.
But has
major
the
objective
Ethiopian
of-
government,
Sorry.
I'm sorry for interrupting, has the Ethiopian government explicitly demanded the Eritrean government to withdraw?
Yes, it did. It did ask for Eritrean forces to leave. I mean, not very loudly, but it was there. There have been statements which do look at it. But I don't think it's going to happen unless is a serious threat of war. And at the moment, I don't see that happening. Although there is now this whole issue of the coastline.
The issue of internally displaced persons in Tigray is of great concern. These IDPs have been forced to flee their homes and are living in dire conditions, lacking food aid and medical assistance. Many have succumbed to starvation and lack of medication. Despite their pleas to return home, the government has not taken any substantial action. Could you provide an insight to the reasons behind this lack of action and any plan to address this situation?
I don't think there are any plans at the moment because it would require removing the Amhara forces, the Fano, and the Eritreans, particularly from Western Tigray and from areas of Southern Tigray. And yes, there are clashes between the Ethiopian forces and the Amhara now. But Abiy has to be careful because how many people can he alienate? He doesn't really have the Tigrayans as his supporters. Well, I mean, goodness me, they certainly doesn't. The Amhara are now alienated because they think that he hasn't been tough enough with Tigray. I mean, I'm not saying what I think, but I mean that I think is there.
Yes, I understand.
And there are ongoing clashes in Oromia. I mean, I suppose the only area that's relatively quiet is of the major ethnic groups is the Somalis. So he has plenty of things to worry about without having another war with Eritrea to force them out. He won't do it. He might do it for other reasons, but Isaias will not leave because he thinks he has failed. He failed to get rid of the TPLF and the Tigrayan people. He failed to crush Tigray. Yes, Tigray has been dealt a terrible blow, but he did not end Tigray's status as a major power, as a major region, and as a nation. So, from his point of view, it was not a success. The suffering has been immense, but there's no resolution from Isaias's point of view either.
But major part of the peace agreement is getting back the territorial integrity, and I guess it was that. And so we can say that the Ethiopian government, if the Ethiopian government failed to keep the territorial integrity that was promised in the peace agreement, then it is safe to say that he has failed in implementing the peace agreement.
Yeah. Yes. And
Okay, that was my question.
no, you're right. But I mean, what follows from it? That's the problem. Is that, as I said earlier on, you don't win at the negotiating table what you don't win on the battlefield. And Tigray didn't win.
Yes, and so the peace agreement is lacking.
Yes, and it's always been lacking. It's always been the best that could be negotiated. I'm not criticizing the negotiators. I think they did everything that was possible in desperate situations. But I mean, there came a moment when a settlement was required, and thank goodness it wasn't possible for the Eritrean, Ethiopian, the Amhara forces to actually reach Mekelle, but as they had done before, of course, you held them, but that was about as good as it got. So it wasn't as if the negotiators in Pretoria or Nairobi had no cards to play, but they didn't have men. And I think in the circumstances, they did the very best that they could. I don't blame them in the slightest for signing up to it. I mean, the scale of your losses are unbelievable. And I mean, I've seen pictures, I've spoken to people who've been to Tigray recently, and the suffering and well, I mean, I don't have to tell you how deeply, deeply people are affected by it, and I mean, your hearts must be broken. I mean, there can't be a family that doesn't have these losses. I'm afraid I don't think anybody's coming to your rescue. Nobody but ourselves. That must be your motto.
The peace process involved mediating parties like African Union. What roles have they played so far, and how effective have their efforts been? Additionally, what roles are they currently undertaking, and what can we expect from them moving forward?
I have look. The African Union was described many, many years ago by President Yoweri Museveni when he came to power as a club of dictators, and frankly, that's what it is. It's a club for those in power. You may remember that they said they weren't going to allow any more coups, and yet we've had a string of coups in West Africa, and they said, no, we will not accept this. We've got a standby brigade. We're going to go in and fight. No, they haven't. So I wouldn't take the African Union terribly seriously. Yes, they did get involved, and I think the Kenyan government is to be thanked for their standing by the position and for doing everything they could to try and get some kind of stability. And look, the situation isn't as bad as it could have been. You could have still been in war. You could have had your forces, retreating back into the mountains and the hills. You could have had Mekelle occupied and under foreign forces. The situation is better than it was, but I'm afraid it's going to require, in my view, look, and I'm not a Tigrayan, so I have no right to make any suggestions. But in my view, I think there are two things that are required. The first is to deal with the internal differences that I know exist inside Tigray now, and the arguments, disputes, should we say, discussions that are happening between the fighters, between the various political parties, and between the intellectuals. And you have to resolve that in some kind of way, because a lot of the issues were, shall we say, suppressed during the war, and you have to come to some kind of resolution on it. The second thing that you have to do, in my view, is that you have to find a way of living with the rest of Ethiopia. Now, where will your alliances be? I mean, you don't want to have a bad relationship with the Amhara. In the end, you're going to have to come to some kind of compromise. about Western Tigray, about Southern Tigray, with them, because at the end of the day, you as one of my friends who was a Palestinian said to me about Israel and Palestine, he said, look, in the end, we are doomed to live with each other. You are doomed to live with the Amhara as your neighbors. It's never going to change. So find a way of getting around that. Now, I can't tell you what that way is, but it requires, careful negotiation. And, if I was sitting in Tigray, I would look to the churches as a way forward. I mean, I know that it's not their role, but they are one of the great intellectual and spiritual forces. Now, I know there have been difficulties particularly inside the Coptic Church, and it's not for me to tell anybody what to do, but I would be looking to them perhaps as a source of careful consideration to bring peace, because that surely is the message of the church and of Christianity. And the second thing is then to also think about, what do you want to do with your Eritrean neighbors? They are your neighbors. I mean, I remember when the border was opened, how the joy that there was in that exchange and the trade. And the third area that you have to think about is, Prime Minister Abiy maybe have his own reasons for looking to the sea, but why not negotiate something? All of these things could be negotiated with a bit of goodwill, but I'm afraid, people in the Horn of Africa, like people elsewhere, are incredibly stubborn. And that's, in a sense, your biggest obstacle, is finding a way forward so that you can reach a negotiated position. But, my heart goes out to the people of Tigray, and particularly to the women who have suffered so badly, to all the families who have lost their loved ones. And
So
I
you
think
think,
that
yeah.
it only can be resolved by standing on your own feet. There is nobody else who's going to help you.
So you think there is a way to negotiate with the Eritrean government,
Not with the government, but
with the people?
President Isaias will not be there forever.
The agreement emphasizes resolving issues through political discussions. Why haven't any political discussions commenced yet? What are the challenges or factors that have hindered the start of these discussions, and are there any plans to overcome them?
Do you mean political discussions inside Tigray, or political
No,
discussions
in
with
Ethiopia,
the government?
between the federal government and the Tigrayan regional government.
Oh, well, as they always say, it takes two to tango. The Tigrayan government, I'm sure, would like to open negotiations. I can't see why they would not do it. But Prime Minister Abiy has other issues on his plate at the moment. It's not causing him much trouble. As far as he's concerned, Tigray can go to hell and rot.
Based on the paradigm observed so far, what can you predict about the future of this agreement and its implementation? Share your insights and potential outcomes.
I'm going to turn that offer down. Thank you. The future is not ours to see, as the song says. We will see what happens. It's pointless making predictions. They are almost always wrong. I mean, I was wrong about the Berlin Wall falling. I was wrong about the election of President Trump. And many other ones. I'm not going to predict the future. Living with the present is bad enough. Trying to understand it and trying to get to grips with the past is enough of a task. The future is just impossible. As I said, the only thing I can suggest is the need to stand on your own feet.
Yes, I meant the regarding the peace agreement. What can we expect from the peace agreement going forward, moving forward, seeing what we've seen, observing the results so far?
I think we'll see what we've seen so far is the most likely answer. An inadequate peace agreement that doesn't deliver what people hoped for, but sort of is like a sticking plaster on a wound. Yes, the wound may heal underneath, but it's not because of the sticking plaster, it's because of the body.
Mr. Plout, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure. and you know, it's always been an honor for me to be involved in the Horn of Africa, which I have been since the 1970s, as a fellow African, because I am from South Africa, but you know, as an outsider, and you know, and I can only be an observer. It's up to people of the Horn of Africa to find their own future. But I wish you all well, and you know, there are so many difficulties that you have, but it is particularly to the women of Tigray that I pay my respects, and my heart goes out to them for what they have suffered and are still suffering.
That concludes this edition of our Direct Talk. Thank you so much for tuning in.